I'm going to start the meeting. So as everyone's coming in, I'm just going to start with the housekeeping. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating in our virtual public meeting for the All-American Asphalt facility in Irvine. My name is Susan Nakamura. I am South Coast AQMD's Chief Operating Officer. And before we begin, I wanted to review some guidelines and general instructions for the meeting. So this meeting is translated in Mandarin, and to hear the meeting in the language of your choice, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the group icon labeled Interpretation. From there, select either English or Mandarin. After you select your language, if you still happen to hear both languages at the same time, then please click the Mute Original Audio button. So if you're participating by phone and wish to hear the meeting in Mandarin, then please call 669-900-6833 and enter the meeting ID number 931-1258-4181. Please be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of recording in the public domain by the South Coast AQMD. We ask that you silence your communication devices, such as your cell phone or desk phone. This will ensure that we are not hearing any feedback or causing interruptions during the meeting. All participants in Zoom, except for the South Coast AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. If you will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. Everyone will be given the opportunity to make public comment. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less to provide everyone an opportunity to speak. For public comments, a countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. If interpretation is needed, more time will be allotted. If you would like to make a public comment on Zoom, please click on the raise hand button. For those that are calling by phone, you can dial *9 to signal that you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted, or you may be dropped from the meeting. For questions or issues related to the meeting to making public comment, please call 909-396-2311. The slides are available for download in English and in Chinese on our website at www.aqmd.gov/all one word All American Asphalt Meeting. So I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Officer, Wayne Nastry. Wayne, you're on mute.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry about that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Wayne Nastry. I'm the Executive Officer of the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I think many of you know that we have been committed to addressing the air pollution concerns, both from the city and the community regarding All American Asphalt. And our commitment has taken shape in the form of community monitoring, facility inspections, complaint response, looking at emissions data, providing that emissions data, looking at assessments for potential health risk assessments and other impacts from the facility. And tonight, we're going to be providing an update on several of the ongoing efforts that we're engaged in that address, I think, most of the concerns and issues raised by the city and by many of the residents. So I'd like to first introduce our board member, Yorba Linda Mayor and Mayor Carlos Rodriguez. Mayor Rodriguez represents the cities of Orange County on our governing board. And so Mayor Rodriguez, please take it away.
Well, good evening and thank you, Wayne. I'd like to thank the city of Irvine for continuing to work with South Coast Air Quality Management District on issues related to All American Asphalt or AAA. As Wayne said, South Coast Air Quality Management District is committed to working with the city and community on issues related to AAA. and we hope this meeting will be productive for all in attendance. I would now like to introduce the City of Irvine Mayor Farah Khan for some opening remarks to start the meeting. Mayor, your leadership and partnership on these issues is greatly appreciated. Mayor Khan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us for this community meeting. As you know, I want to assure all our residents that the city takes the matter of AAA seriously. And we have been and will continue to work with AQMD and their scientists, some of who actually live in Irvine, to make sure that our communities are safe. And we want to make sure that we are understanding the data that is before us. And so I look forward to tonight's meeting and discussion, and thank you all again for being here.
Thanks, Mayor Khan. I know before we begin, there are a few other people we'd like to recognize. I think we have Councilman Agwin from your city council. And I'm not sure we have any others, but if we get notice, I'll be sure to introduce them. So I apologize if I missed anybody right now, but we will get to you as soon as we identify you. So tonight we're going to have 3 staff presentations. We're going to hear about the annual emissions report and a summary of the health risk assessment, as well as a discussion on our Title V permit and public notice. Following the presentation, we'll be open for public comments. And so let's begin, because I know you all probably have a lot of questions. So our Ian McMillan, our Assistant Deputy Executive Officer of Planning, Rural Development and Implementation, will be presenting on the first 2 topics. So Ian, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And thank you everybody for being with us here tonight. We know everybody's very busy in their evenings. We have a lot of information to present tonight. I'll try to be brief, but let's go ahead and let's just get started. So the next slide, please. So we talked through some of the agenda already. Let's go to the next slide. Next. So just a quick bit of background. I think most folks who would be on this call would know who South Coast AQMD is, but just to make sure we're all working from the same base data. So South Coast AQMD, we are a multi-county air pollution control agency for the 4 counties you see here on the slide. We oversee about 28,000 permitted sources, and there's about 17 million people in our jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Just for a bit of background, obviously this is a long-running issue that has spanned multiple years. We have held 2 community meetings in the past related to All-American Asphalt, one in 2020, another in 2021. We're again here now this year. Wayne touched on a number of the different tools that we use to evaluate air quality impacts from facilities, including air monitoring, complaint response, on-site inspections, communications, of course, with those in the community, with the city, and then what we'll be talking about tonight is there's emissions reporting programs, health risk assessment programs, permitting, et cetera. There's a lot of information available on our website. You see the link there, www.aqmd.gov/AAA. And one of the things that I'm really going to try to work through or walk through on the first 2 presentations is we're coming close to, or we are really at the end of a lot of these processes. Many are going to continue, but we are at the end of some of the key processes. And we know there's been a lot of discussion in the community about AAA. And so the goal here is to present the information as we understand it and to explain why we are coming to the conclusions that we're coming to. So next slide, please. So first, we'll talk about the emissions reporting. That's the base data that's used for a lot of other programs. So next slide, please. So first, just again, to make sure we're all on the same page, we're talking about the All-American Asphalt plant in Irvine. You see maps there showing where it's located up in the hills. Next slide, please. So just a brief bit of background about the annual emissions reporting program for South Coast AQMD. So this program requires about 1,500 facilities to report their emissions to to the air district every year. They do this through a self-reporting process. There are a lot of technical guidance documents that facilities must follow. There's an online reporting system, and they are required to submit all those reports under the guidance that's available. Facilities that are required to report are those that are a little bit larger, so that they would have at least 4 tons per year of emissions of what we call criteria pollutants. That would be for nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, and then greater than 100 tons of carbon monoxide. These emission reports really are focused just on the on-site emissions from a facility. So their process emissions, for example, are really the key emissions that are inputted into the annual emissions reporting program. Other facilities are also using the AER program to report their emissions. This includes under the Air Toxic Hotspots program, also called AB 2588. Those facilities report their emissions through AER. And then the state has a new emissions reporting regulation that is just starting to be phased in. This is called the Criteria and Toxics Reporting Regulation, CTR. There's a lot of acronyms, but for that regulation, facilities will also be reporting through the AER program. Finally, the emissions data that is reported to the air district, to South Coast AQMD, that is then posted onto our website. We call that FIND. I think many people know about this website. The information that is reported, when facilities report that information to us, and there's a reporting season that's usually in the spring, the information is automatically posted to our website. And so there is not any auditing in between when facilities report their emissions to us and then when it makes its way onto our website. There are some basic data validation processes for when facilities enter their information, but in general, it just goes straight to the website, and auditing then follows. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the emissions that were reported by All American Asphalt to South Coast AQMD, certainly we have heard from some of the community some concerns about some discrepancies or some differences in between reporting years. And so what's shown here is for some unaudited data from 2016 and 2017, that there were some notable differences. And these differences were notable because the key inputs into emissions were not that different. And so if you look at the natural gas usage or their activity data related to the aggregate production or their diesel fuel usage, we see that between 2016 and 2017, there was not very large differences. And these would be really the key inputs to determine what the emissions are from the facility. But when we look at the pollutants that were reported, and just 2 are highlighted here, if we look at VOCs, also called volatile organic compounds, we see that there is a significant increase that is reported between 2016 and 2017. And again, for benzene, an even larger increase that's being reported between those 2 years. And then the real question is, are those real increases in emissions, or are those an artifact of how the emissions were being reported? Were there calculation errors, et cetera? And so because of these notable differences, staff initiated an audit of the facility to determine what is really happening. Next slide, please. So just a bit about this auditing process. So this is applicable really to all 1,500 facilities, or roughly 1,500 that report to us. And there's some basic screening that is conducted every year for all of the facilities to see who should be audited. Some things like trend analysis across the years, or other sorts of checks to see which facilities do require auditing. And as I just mentioned, some of what was shown on the previous slide is one of the things that would really trigger an audit, and that's what happened for AAA. Once that occurs, it starts off originally as more of a desktop audit. When I say desktop, that means that staff will contact the facility and have the facility provide verification information about the data that was provided. They'll provide records to demonstrate that what they provided was accurate, or emission calculations to show how they came up with their numbers. We will also look through inspection reports or other sorts of information that we have at the Air District, for example, source test data, and I'll talk a little bit more about source tests in a little bit, but we use all the information that's available to us to try to understand what is the emissions profile from facilities. Next slide. So when we looked at the AAA facility in particular, there were a number of discrepancies and differences between what was reported and what is required by guidance, and then also just differences from year to year in the emissions reporting. And so some of those are highlighted here. Some of the key ones really are highlighted here. So for example, control factors for VOCs, and a control factor is the percent reduction one would expect from emission controls that are applied to say a stack of emissions or something like that. And so the control factors were incorrectly applied for VOCs, and then their associated toxics emissions for several pieces of equipment at AAA. Some of the control efficiencies for particulate matter were double counted. So for example, they said, oh, well, it's controlled 90% and it's controlled 90% again. And that was a mistake that the facility had made. There were some incorrect emissions, emission factors, or those are the rate of emissions coming from equipment for ammonia and for various combustion equipment. Some of the toxic metals emissions were also missing and not reported for several of the processes at the facility. And then one of the source tests that was used, and again, a source test is a specific test that is conducted on a single piece of equipment to determine the emissions really just from that one piece of equipment. And so there was a source test that was being used as a basis for the calculations, and that was an incorrect source test to use because it was for a different facility. So all of these discrepancies were highlighted to the facility by AQMD staff, and we let them know that these corrections were required to fix all of these deficiencies. Next slide, please. In addition to that, there are a number of different methods for estimating emissions. There are, for example, national default emission factors. So for example, the US EPA, they put out emission calculation methodologies that are applicable across the country. And these really are defaults, but if there are site-specific data that is available, that really is always preferred to understand what are the emissions from the facility. And so in this case, there were specific source tests for a variety of reasons. They were required, or AAA was required to conduct some source tests to look at what is exactly happening at their facility rather than relying on national defaults. And these source tests, I do want to emphasize that this really is the best way to get an accurate profile of emissions from a facility. There's instrumentation that is used at the facility. There are very specific protocols and methods that must be followed that are for example, EPA or CARB approved methods. The protocols are required to be submitted to the South Coast AQMD, where we review the protocol and approve it prior to any testing being conducted. The source testing companies that do the actual source testing itself are observed by AQMD staff. They're approved as well to conduct the source tests. The source test itself is then taken or is then submitted to AQMD and is reviewed for accuracy and making sure that all guidelines were followed. So it's a very rigorous process to look at these source tests for facilities. So this was required for several pieces of equipment at AAA, and that data that was then verified, including making sure that when the source test was conducted, it was done either in a conservative manner or typical for operations at the facility. So they are not underreporting, for example, or have very low activity and then conduct a source test. They're required to make sure that they are doing at least representative, if not higher than normal operations to make sure that we have an accurate understanding of their emissions. And then when we were looking at the emission reports to correct, there was a notable difference, as I just referenced in some previous slides, between the years 2016 and 2017. Those were not the only years that there were some differences and some errors that were noted by staff. Those also persisted into later years. And so ultimately, what staff directed AAA to do was to amend all of their emissions reports from 2015 through 2021. This is longer period than auditing usually goes back. Usually that historic look back is only maybe about 3 years, sometimes up to 5 years. Often it's only just 1 year. But in this case, because of the errors that had been noted, and certainly there's been a lot of concern that we've heard from the community trying to understand what the emissions profile is for this facility, a longer period was used. But I do want to note that this audit and the corrected emissions reports that have been provided to South Coast AQMD, those only go back through 2015. So that means in 2014, those are effectively unaudited emissions that are in our fine database. So there will be a difference if one compares 2014 unaudited data versus 2015 audited data. There is a difference in emissions being reported. That does not mean that there is an actual large increase in actual emissions that occurred at that time. This really is just an artifact of how the emissions were reported to South Coast AQMD. So the 2015 through 2021 data is what we believe is verified and accurate. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight some examples of what we're talking about graphically here. So this first graph shows unaudited reports of, again, VOCs. These are volatile organic compounds. And it shows on the blue line, the production of hot mix asphalt, and showing year by year how much asphalt was produced at the facility. And this is an important indicator to show the level of activity at the facility. And this is really a good, has a nice nexus between what the emissions would be from the facility. And we see is that orange line showing VOCs, that there's not a very good correlation there. There's a little bit of a loose correlation in the later years, but there's really some big differences between 2016, 2017, 2018, 2015. And so this is the unaudited data. Next slide. After going through all of the audits and going through with a fine-tooth comb and trying to understand the emissions profile, this is what the audited data looks like. And we see now that there's a very close correlation between the production data, for which there are records for what the facility has actually produced, and then looking at the emissions profile, and we see a very close correlation, which is what would be expected when thinking about how emissions are formed from a plant like this. Next slide. Similarly, for air toxics, we see that there's a similar inconsistency between the production data shown in the blue line and pollutants. And actually, different pollutants show different inconsistencies. So the green line, for example, for formaldehyde shows one pattern, but the orange line for, I think that's for ammonia, shows a different pattern, et cetera. And again, this is unaudited data, so that when we go to the next slide, and we see once all the data has been audited and has been verified, we see that there is a much closer correlation between the production and the activity that's occurring at the facility and the toxics emissions that are being reported. Okay, next slide, please. At this point, I would like to pivot to what do we do with this emissions data. So this emissions data is available on our FIND website. It has been updated over the last few weeks as it's been going through the audit process and being ported into our FIND system. It is all on the FIND website right now. So it is available for people to view, but then what's the next stage? And now we're going to be talking about that next stage. And this is the health risk assessment. Next slide, please. So for our air toxic hotspots program, AB 2588, this program is really unique in California compared to many other states, and that this looks at the toxics emissions from facilities and from their existing emissions, and it routinely goes back and looks at emissions from facilities and to try to paint a profile of what are the toxic health impacts from facilities. And so every 4 years, facilities in this program have to report their toxic emissions to South Coast AQMD. And we'll then use that information to determine what the next steps are. And it's a series of increasingly robust levels of analysis to understand what are the potential health impacts from a facility. This, by design, under statute, is somewhat of a lengthy process, and it's because it's a very detailed engineering analysis, not just of one device, but of an entire facility and looking at all the facility as a whole and every single device and doing a detailed engineering analysis to understand what is happening with their emissions and does it pose a risk on whole to the community that surrounds it. This program is implemented through South Coast AQMD Rule 1402. The reason I bring that up is that Rule 1402 is actually more stringent than state law. And so facilities are required to comply with the more stringent requirements within Rule 1402. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a series of more robust or escalating levels of analysis within the 2588 program. So the first part of this presentation, I walked through the annual emission reporting process, and that reports, facilities report toxic emissions every year, but it's a small list of toxics. It's the most common toxic air pollutants are reported through that annual emissions reporting. And it's really just basic data that we get, total emissions, and just a little bit more detail beyond that. Within the AB 2588 program, additional data is also provided for a much more comprehensive suite of air toxics. Really, it's all air toxics that we believe might pose health risks to community. They have to report this long list of toxic pollutants every 4 years. Using that data, the staff in the AB 2588 program prioritizes which facilities might pose potential health risks above South Coast AQMD thresholds. And then if they potentially do at a screening level, at a very conservative analysis, they then have to move on to the next stage. And that next stage, in this case, would be called an air toxics information report. Again, that's yet one more air toxics report, but this is as detailed as one could get. It provides very detailed device level data about toxics emissions, but it also provides critical information such as how the emissions are released, how quickly do they come out of a stack, what's their temperature, et cetera. This information is really critical to use for computer modeling to determine do these emissions pose potential health risks to communities. So it's really just very important input data into what we use for a health risk assessment to determine a facility's impacts on the community. Next slide, please. So the health risk assessment, which is one of the key reports in the AB 2588 program. This really presents all of the information that's available to determine whether or not there's a chance that a person could experience a health effect from a toxic air contaminant. There are some key assumptions that go into these health risk assessments. First, they are based on a snapshot year. And when I say a snapshot, it is assuming that emissions from a single calendar year persist for several decades, because most of the potential health risks require long-term exposure before a human would actually experience what those health effects are in most instances. And so this is, because this is a program that repeats every 4 years, the idea of a snapshot can work because in 4 years they come right back and they're going to be looking at the update in the next 4 years. Another one of the really key features of health risk assessments is that they all follow a very similar, not very similar, they all follow a prescribed state mandated methodology. And so that all facilities have to follow the exact same methodology. There are some real advantages to this. One, it allows comparisons between facilities to make sure that when we say that there's a chance of getting, a cancer risk from a facility, that we understand that that can translate from one facility to another because they all follow the exact same methods. And then also because they all follow the same methods, one can apply thresholds. And so for South Coast AQMD, we have thresholds for when public notification will be required, when a facility is required to take action to reduce risks from their facility, but all because there's the same methodology that's applied. And this is based off of state regulation. Next slide. One of the things that a health risk assessment does not do is it does not evaluate odors. Odors certainly, they can present themselves in a lot of ways. There are good odors. You can walk by a bakery, it can smell good, and then you can walk by a dumpster and it can smell very bad. And certainly from facilities, there are odors that can come from many facilities. What the health risk assessment does is not determine what the odors are from a facility, but it determines whether or not compounds released from the facility, whether or not they have an odor, it determines if those compounds potentially present health risks to community. And so what we do know is that the HRAs, the health risk assessments, are not really a good tool for odors, for evaluating odors. But what we do have is we have other tools. And so, for example, shown here on the screen, our 1-800-CUT-SMOG program really is our main hotline for any air quality complaints, odors or otherwise. Those can also be submitted via app. We have a very nice app, or also online. And then our compliance team can go out and follow up on what all those air quality concerns are. We know many of the community have used these resources in the past, and we really point people in the direction of using these tools if there are concerns like odors. Next slide, please. So for All American Asphalt, the process that they had to follow under Rule 1402 was they did have to conduct that air toxics information inventory report, and they were required in February 2020 to prepare it. That then fed into a health risk assessment. That health risk assessment was ultimately approved in August of this year. And we're going to be reporting on the results of that health risk assessment here in these slides. That HRA is based on that snapshot year of 2016. And that is one of their every 4 years that a facility has to, that AAA facility has to report. 2016 was one of those 4 years. 2020 was another period. One question that we have heard is, well, why wasn't 2020 used for the HRA instead of 2016? There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we complete a cycle before we move on to the next one to make sure we understand what's happening. And what we have seen, and including in the previous slides, was that 2016 emissions were higher than 2020 emissions. So 2016 is actually conservative if we assume that 2016 persists for several decades. The next thing that we see too is that we don't see that there's any substantial change to the facility that would increase emissions from new equipment or new processes that were not accounted for in the 2016 emissions inventory. And so the 2016 data is really that basis for this HRA. So we are now concluded with that 2016 cycle. The 2020 cycle, based on the 2016 HRA, we're not going to require a new health risk assessment because the 2016 is conservative relative to 2020. But again, in 2024, they're going to report their emissions again, and we'll start this process fresh, go through the priority process to see what the next steps are for this facility. Next slide. I've mentioned thresholds that South Coast AQMD uses to determine next steps for facilities in the AB 2588 program. There's 3 main thresholds that are used. One is for cancer risk. This is the increased probability that somebody would get cancer. And these typically are measured in chances per million. So I think people are used to the term percent. If it's 10%, then it's 10 out of 100. If it's per million, say 1 per million, then that's 1 chance per million. So the thresholds that are used for our program are shown here on the top. You see the public notification. That threshold is 10 chances per million. So if there is a cancer risk to, for example, a residential location from a facility, and that cancer risk is greater than 10 chances in a million, then that facility will have to notify the public and let them know, hey, the emissions from my facility cause a potential health risk to a certain area. If the risks are even higher at 25 chances per million, shown in yellow, then they would be required to take an additional step. They would have to notify the public. And in addition, they would have to take actions, for example, adding controls, changing some of their processes, et cetera, to ensure that the risks stay less than 25 chances per million. And then finally, a significant risk is used to determine if a facility needs to really move into the fast track and take accelerated actions to reduce their risks. And so that's if cancer risk, for example, is greater than 100 chances per million. For most health risk assessments, the cancer risk is the determining factor for whether or not a facility needs to take any of these actions, but not in all cases. A different way for measuring cancer risk is to look at cancer burden. So rather than looking at any one location and whether the cancer risk is high at a particular location, the cancer burden looks at a community on whole. And on whole, is there a chance of an increased occurrence of cancer cases overall across the population? based off of the distribution of cancer risks throughout a population. And what we see there is that there's a threshold for risk reduction, and that's a unitless number of 0.5. And then finally, for non-cancer risks, and these are still toxic risks, but these would not be causing cancer, we have other thresholds based off of something called a hazard index. And the hazard index is always a confusing term to describe. It is really just a number that is used to say if there's a hazard index greater than 1, then the most sensitive people in a population could be expected to potentially experience a non-cancer health effect. The higher the number, the higher the chance that somebody would experience a health effect. If it's less than 1, then they're not expected to experience that non-cancer health effect. Similar to the cancer risk, we see that we have public notification, risk reduction, and significant risk thresholds. Click. Great. So in the health risk assessment for AAA, all of the thresholds that were just whited out were not exceeded. So none of those thresholds were exceeded, but the public notification for the non-cancer hazard index was exceeded. So I'll talk about that on this next slides here. Next slide, please. So in particular, for short-term non-cancer health risks, the emissions from AAA do result in off-site levels that would exceed South Coast AQMD thresholds. In particular, this is, we call it the acute risk, and this is based off of a 1-hour exposure. This is not based off of decades of exposure, it's based off of a 1-hour exposure. But this does only affect an area in the immediate vicinity of the facility. Really, it's at the fence line and just within a few hundred feet of it. I'll show a map in the coming slides of that impact area. It's not really accessible to the public, but it is not within the control of the facility. So because of that, they are over this threshold, and there is notification that the facility is required to do to the property that were are impacted by that risk. The main risk itself is from nickel emissions. So nickel, the metal, that's really the main risk driver for this acute short-term impact, and it's mainly from welding operations and other operations at the plant. When we think about short-term effects from nickel, there's really 2 main ones that are talked about. One is really something more like a skin rash. Think of poison oak or poison ivy, that sort of contact dermatitis that would then go away once somebody removes themselves from that exposure. And then also there's a potential for an asthmatic reaction as well. And so this would again only be for those for those people who happen to be, for example, staying for an hour right about at the fence line of the facility, which is not expected to really be anybody in the public at all. Next slide, please. I guess, yeah, so I'm sorry, I should have explained this graphic here on the left. So we show here the different thresholds that I mentioned on the previous slide for the notification threshold, the risk reduction threshold. You see that the health risks, and this is the maximum health risk from the facility offsite. You can see that is right in between the risk reduction and the notification threshold for this facility. Next slide, please. When we look at cancer risk, and again, remember that cancer risk is commonly the most common concern for air toxics from facilities. In this case, for AAA, the cancer risk is below South Coast AQMD thresholds at all locations where people live or work. And so we see the notification threshold is 10 chances per million. The maximum cancer risk from this facility is 4.5 chances per million. So well below any thresholds for public notification or risk reduction. Next slide, please. So on this map, you can see here in red the facility boundary for AAA. It's that square in the center of the screen. And then you see in yellow, this is the impacted area for that acute risk. And you see that it is just outside the facility's fence line, just in that immediate vicinity. Can you click one more time? And we see that this is quite far from any residential locations. Those are located about 2,300 feet away at the closest point. And so this notification area and exceedance of South Coast AQMD thresholds does not reach out into any of that residential area. And I do want to emphasize that this health risk assessment, again, I've walked through kind of a whole series of processes, but this is based off of kind of all of those processes to this point have resulted in this, have provided this result showing the health risks here. Next slide, please. And so to emphasize the point here that these health risk assessments that are conducted, we really try to look at all information that is available to us. And what we're finding is that all lines of evidence are pointing to the same conclusion. Now that we've gone through the auditing process, we've gone through the verification process, we've gone through source testing, there's been permit evaluations, we've had inspectors out at the facility, we have certainly also out in community. We have looked at this health risk assessment, emissions reports. There's regional air toxic studies that we conduct as well that I haven't really talked about here, called our MATE study. And that looks at all air toxics from all sources across the community. And we're finding that the results here are not inconsistent with what has been conducted in that regional study. And most importantly, we've also done neighborhood air monitoring. And I know in previous meetings with community, we've walked through that air monitoring, and this health risk assessment, again, is very consistent with the findings of that air monitoring. So a lot of independent lines of evidence are all pointing to the same conclusions that I'm presenting here today. Next slide, please. So if people are interested in more information about AB 2588, please go to our website. A lot of information that's available there. The HRA itself, if anybody wants to read that, it is a technical report, but all the information is in that health risk assessment linked here. Please reach out. We have a hotline as well as an email address for anybody who wants to talk about this some more. Next slide. Okay, thank you very much for your patience with me. I'm going to turn it over now to Jason Asphalt, the Deputy Executive Officer for our permitting program, to talk about Title V permitting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deputy Executive Officer Jason Asphalt. I oversee the Engineering and Permitting Division at South Coast AQMD, and I will be presenting our Title V permitting efforts at All American Asphalt. Next slide, please. So first off, I just want to provide some background on our overall permitting program. South Coast AQMD requires any stationary equipment that emits air pollution or controls air pollution to obtain a permit. There are, of course, some exceptions to this requirement if there's a low emitting equipment or we have limited jurisdiction over mobile sources as well. When facilities apply for a permit, we conduct an engineering analysis and verify compliance with all our rules. And for new or modified equipment with an increase of emissions, this may include an analysis for what we call our new source review requirements, which ensures that the most stringent controls are required at time of permitting, and also that any emission increases are offset. So this analysis is based on the potential to emit for a piece of equipment, or how much pollution the maximum operation will emit. And we make requirements enforceable through permit conditions. So we have two different permit programs, one for smaller minor emission sources, such as gas stations or companies that may only have one or two permits. And for the larger major emitting sources, there is the Title V permitting program, which there are about 320 such facilities in our basin. Next slide, please. So tonight we are presenting the initial Title V permit for All American Asphalt. This is not coupled with the previous presentations that Ian just provided. The facility has or currently has permits under our minor source permitting program, but they will be transitioning those permits into the Title V permitting program. Title V is the federal permitting program that is delegated to South Coast AQMD by US EPA. Title V is part of the Clean Air Act amendments, and it was meant to standardize air quality permits across the nation. EPA does not have a permitting program for minor sources, so there is this process to transition these minor source permits to the Title V program. Next slide, please. The Title V program applies to the larger emitting facilities referred to as major sources. Major source thresholds have been established for South Coast AQMD based on our level of non-attainment with the federal ambient air quality standards. These thresholds are adopted and listed in our rules. And there are two ways a facility can become subject to the Title V permitting requirements, actual or potential emissions. First, if a facility is applying for a permit for a modification that results in an emission increase that causes the facility's proposed emissions from the project to go over Title V thresholds, then the facility will be brought into the Title V program during that process. The other way is through annual emissions reporting, which was just discussed. If a facility's actual reported emissions exceed Title V thresholds, then they may be brought into the Title V program as well. So there is some extra analysis that goes into the process, since calculation procedures slightly differ between minor and major source programs. But All-American Asphalt is being brought into the Title V permitting program because they reported annual emissions above major source thresholds. Next slide, please. So now we will go into the process of the initial Title V permit. First, the facility is required to submit the initial Title V permit application within 180 days of triggering Title V requirements. In this case, All-American Asphalt failed to submit a timely permit application for that, and they were issued a notice of violation. After application submittal, staff conducts an analysis and evaluation of the existing minor source permits, and they review all the existing permit conditions to ensure that they are current for existing rule requirements. The evaluation is referred to as the statement of basis and contains the analysis of all the applicable rules and emissions. So now this step has been completed. The proposed facility permit and statement of basis are reviewed by EPA, and concurrently there is a 30-day public review and comment period. This comment period started today for the initial Title V permit for All-American Asphalt. South Coast AQMD will be listening to comments regarding the permit tonight, and will also be accepting written comments within this 30-day period. We will be responding to all the gathered comments regarding the permit prior to issuance, and the comments and responses will also be provided to EPA for their review as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the actual process, staff takes the existing permits and consolidates them into one facility permit document, and then identifies the regulatory basis for each one of the requirements. We add more robust monitoring requirements and the accompanying record-keeping, administrative, and reporting requirements above and beyond the current minor source permits. After this initial effort, the permit is required to be renewed every 5 years and has an expiration date if it is not renewed. And at that time, we'll go through another public notice process. Next slide, please. So it's very important to understand that with this action and this transition process, there are not any emission requirements that are more stringent than the current permits. These are the same permit units. There's no new equipment and no permitted emission increases. And is more of an administrative process as compared to an engineering evaluation that occurs with new equipment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, EPA does review the proposal, and that review period has started in addition to the 30-day public comment period, which will end on October 28th. Additionally, any public hearing request must be submitted within 15 days. This is a more formalized process with a form, and the public hearing request requirements are described in the public notice document. Hearing requests must be pertinent to the permitting action described in the public notice. So all written comments and hearing requests should be submitted to Assistant Deputy Executive Officer Dr. Jillian Wong via standard mail or email. Next slide, please. If anyone is interested in reviewing the proposed permit and the public notice, it may be accessed on our permitting public notice webpage. As a reminder, one more time, we will just be receiving comments regarding the proposed permit tonight, and the public can still submit written comments by October 28th. And then after that date, staff will respond to all the comments prior to any permitting action. That concludes the Title V part of the presentation, and I will hand it back over to our Chief Operating Officer, Susan Nakamura.
Okay, so before we, thank you so much for the presentations, Ian and Jason. And before we go into public comment, I'd like to recognize Congresswoman Porter's representative, Anthony Falcone. And before we go into public comment, public comment will be limited to 3 minutes or less to allow everyone who wishes to speak to do so. As a reminder, we'd like to make, if you'd like to make a comment and are participating by Zoom, we ask that you click the raise your hand icon. And for those that are participating via phone, you would dial *9 to raise your hand. So then when it's your turn to speak, I will call your name, or if you're calling by phone, I'll call the part of the phone number. Usually it's the area code and the last 4 digits. And then we will unmute your line. And then when you're speaking, if you can maintain a normal cadence to help our interpreters, we'd really appreciate that. So we're going to begin, and I'm going to pull up the participants. Okay, so the first person that I have to speak is Jesse Segura, number 652. So Jesse, you can unmute and you can speak. You can start your comments. Jesse, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You'll need to unmute your line. Jesse, we still can't hear you. There you go.
Hi, this is Jesse Segura. No comment on my line. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So the next person that we have is Robert Ruiz.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to speak here this evening. My name is Robert Ruiz, and I am a longtime resident of the city of Irvine. And the only question I have to the residents who want this plant removed is just that, you know, disclosures come when you buy property. This is the equivalent if I'm going to buy a house next to the freeway and then complain about the noise. I really don't understand. You know, the numbers speak for themselves. I'm in full support of the plant staying where it's at. I'm in support of the workers who work at that plant staying at the same place where they work at now. So I'm hoping the city of Irvine does the right and responsible thing here and keeps those workers who work for All American Asphalt at that plant where it's at now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so the next commenter I have is Mike Hernandez.
Can you hear? Oh.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, listen, I don't know why my hand's raised. I didn't raise it, so I have no comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, do we have anyone else that wants to provide any public comments?
There's a Robert Ruiz. Oh,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah, we did Robert Ruiz already. Okay, I'm not seeing any more public comments. Okay, so I think I'm gonna close the public comment. I'm not seeing any more public comments. And so I'd like to thank everybody for attending the meeting tonight. Mayor Rodriguez, did you want to speak?
Yes, thank you. As we conclude this public forum, I want to thank members of the Irvine community for being here and participating in the forum. I also want to thank Mayor Khan for her leadership on this and many other issues. And finally, I'm proud of the work by the professionals at the South Coast Air Quality Management District who have been working so hard on behalf of the people of our service area for cleaner air. Along with the EPA, the staff at AQMD is the most distinguished group of individuals working on clean air standards in the world. I'm grateful to them for their efforts on this issue and so much more. I'm also appreciative of the leadership of our governing board members and my colleagues. It's an honor to serve as the Orange County City's representative on the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Again, thank you for participating tonight and to listen and participate about the data and conclusions of the testing of the All-American Asphalt facility. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you. So this concludes the public meeting.